The sound of my sister's laughter echoing across the backyard patio made my stomach clench with the familiar dread I'd carried to every family gathering for the past 15 years. Victoria's voice cut through the warm summer evening like a blade, sharp and deliberate, designed to draw attention to herself while diminishing everyone around her. I was standing by the dessert table, quietly arranging the homemade brownies I'd brought, when I heard her talking to our cousin Marcus about my latest failure in life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh, you haven't heard about Sophia's newest adventure. Victoria's voice dripped with false concern as she gestured dramatically with her wine glass. She's apparently starting some kind of online business now. You know how she is, always chasing these get-rich-quick schemes that never work out. Remember when she tried to become a yoga instructor, or that ridiculous attempt at freelance writing? Now she's convinced she's going to be some kind of entrepreneur. The way she said entrepreneur made it sound like a dirty word, something embarrassing that polite people shouldn't discuss in public. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as I pretended to focus on arranging the brownies in perfect rows, hoping no one would notice how my hands were trembling. At least she's trying, Marcus said diplomatically, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Victoria had always been persuasive, especially when it came to shaping family opinions about my life choices. Trying is one thing, Victoria continued, warming to her theme. But Sophia has been trying for years without anything to show for it. She's 32 years old, still living in that tiny apartment downtown, driving a car that's older than some of my interns. Meanwhile, I just got promoted to senior marketing director at Henderson & Associates, and Brandon and I are closing on our dream house next month. Brandon, Victoria's fiancé, was standing beside her, nodding along to her monologue with the kind of practiced agreement that came from months of hearing similar speeches. He was everything our parents had hoped Victoria would find: successful, handsome, well-connected, and completely devoted to maintaining her image of perfection. Marcus shifted uncomfortably and took a sip of his beer. Well, I'm sure Sophia will figure things out eventually. She always was the creative one in the family. Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. Creative is a nice way of putting it. I prefer realistic. Some people are dreamers, and some people are achievers. Sophia has always been more of a dreamer, unfortunately. I couldn't take any more. Setting down the plate of brownies with more force than necessary, I turned and walked toward the house, hoping to find a quiet corner where I could collect myself before the humiliation became too obvious. The Rodriguez family reunion happened every summer at my Aunt Carmen's house in Scottsdale, and every year I promised myself I wouldn't let Victoria get under my skin. Every year I failed. My name is Sophia Elena Rodriguez, and until 3 months ago I would have agreed with everything Victoria said about me. I was the family disappointment, the one who couldn't seem to get her life together, the perpetual underachiever who made everyone else feel better about their own accomplishments by comparison. I had bounced from job to job, relationship to relationship, and dream to dream without ever finding anything that stuck. What Victoria didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that 3 months ago everything had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined possible. The online business she was mocking so casually had not only succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, it had made me the kind of money most people only dreamed about. But I had kept it secret, partly because I was still processing the magnitude of what had happened, and partly because I had learned the hard way that sharing good news with my family often resulted in more pain than celebration. I found refuge in my aunt's kitchen, where the familiar smell of her homemade salsa and the gentle hum of conversation from the older relatives provided a buffer against Victoria's performance on the patio. My grandmother Rosa was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 of my great aunts, speaking in rapid Spanish about neighborhood gossip and family drama that had nothing to do with anyone's career achievements or financial status. "Mi hija," Abuela Rosa called to me as I entered the kitchen. "Vinak, come sit with us. You look like you need some peace." My grandmother had always been my refuge during family gatherings. She was the only person who never asked uncomfortable questions about my job or my love life or my plans for the future. She simply accepted me as I was, offering unconditional love and homemade cookies in equal measure. "Victoria is being Victoria again," I said, settling into the chair beside her, and accepting the plate of flan she immediately placed in front of me. Ay, esa niña. Abuela Rosa shook her head disapprovingly. Always so worried about what other people think. That one. She forgets that real success comes from the heart, not from impressing strangers. My great-aunt Elena nodded in agreement. When I was your age, Sophia, I had 3 jobs and no idea what I wanted to do with my life. Now look at me. 92 years old and still learning new things every day. Life is not a race, me. Their words were comforting, but they couldn't completely erase the sting of Victoria's public humiliation. For 32 years I had been the family's cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you didn't follow the conventional path to success. Victoria, on the other hand, had always been the golden child, the one who did everything right, who made our parents proud, who served as proof that the Rodriguez family could produce successful, respectable members of society. The contrast between us had been established early and reinforced constantly throughout our childhood. Victoria was 2 years older, 2 inches taller, and infinitely more confident in every situation. She had been valedictorian of her high school class, homecoming queen, and recipient of a full scholarship to Arizona State University. She had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in marketing, landed a prestigious internship at a Fortune 500 company, and climbed the corporate ladder with the kind of systematic determination that impressed everyone who met her. I, on the other hand, had been the artsy one, the dreamer, the girl who spent more time writing stories than studying for tests. I had scraped through high school with mediocre grades, bounced between 3 different colleges before finally graduating with a degree in English literature, and then spent the next decade trying to figure out what to do with my life. I had worked as a barista, a bookstore clerk, a freelance writer, a yoga instructor, and a dozen other jobs that Victoria loved to remind everyone were not real careers. What hurt the most about Victoria's constant criticism was that until recently, I had believed she was right. I had internalized the family narrative that positioned me as the failure and her as the success. I had accepted that my inability to follow a conventional career path meant I was somehow deficient, lacking the discipline and focus that characterize truly successful people. But 3 months ago, everything had changed in the most unexpected way possible. The online business that Victoria was currently mocking in front of our relatives had started as a desperate attempt to pay my rent when my freelance writing income had dried up during a slow period. I had been facing eviction from my small downtown Phoenix apartment, struggling to make ends meet on irregular freelance assignments that barely covered my basic expenses. In a moment of panic and inspiration, I had decided to combine my love of writing with my lifelong passion for vintage fashion and collectibles. I started a blog called Hidden Treasures, where I wrote about finding valuable vintage items at thrift stores, estate sales, and garage sales. The blog was part treasure hunting guide, part fashion history lesson, and part personal narrative about the stories behind the beautiful objects that people discarded or sold without realizing their true value. The blog had started slowly, attracting a small but dedicated following of vintage enthusiasts and bargain hunters who appreciated my writing style and my eye for valuable pieces. I began incorporating affiliate marketing links for the vintage items I featured, earning small commissions when readers purchased similar pieces from partner retailers. But the real breakthrough had come when I started offering personal shopping services for busy professionals who wanted to incorporate authentic vintage pieces into their wardrobes, but didn't have the time or expertise to hunt for them themselves. What began as a side service for a few blog readers had exploded into a full-fledged business that was generating more income than I had ever imagined possible. Within 6 weeks, I was earning more per month than Victoria made in her prestigious corporate position. Within 3 months, I had hired 2 assistants and was fielding requests from clients across the country who were willing to pay premium prices for my ability to find authentic, high-quality vintage pieces and tell the stories that made them special. The business had grown so quickly that I was still struggling to process the reality of my new financial situation. For the first time in my adult life, I had a savings account with a substantial balance. I could pay my rent 3 months in advance without thinking about it. I had started looking at apartments in neighborhoods I had never dreamed of being able to afford. But I had told no one in my family about any of this, partly because the success was so new that I was afraid it might disappear as quickly as it had arrived, partly because I had learned from painful experience that sharing good news with my family often resulted in more criticism than celebration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And partly because I was enjoying the freedom of having something that was entirely mine, something that Victoria couldn't diminish or appropriate for her own narrative. As I sat in my aunt's kitchen listening to my grandmother and great-aunts chat about their neighbors and their grandchildren, I felt the familiar tension between my desire to prove myself to my family and my need to protect myself from their judgment. Victoria's words on the patio had stung because they reflected years of conditioning that had taught me to see myself through the lens of conventional success metrics that didn't account for creativity, resilience, or the courage to forge an unconventional path. Sophia, my great-aunt Maria said, drawing me back into the conversation. Your grandmother tells me you're working on something new, something with computers and the internet. I nodded carefully, unsure how much to reveal. I have a small online business, it's growing slowly but steadily. That's wonderful, Mija. In my day, women had so few opportunities to start their own businesses. Now you can create something from nothing using just your imagination and your computer. That's real magic. Her words warmed my heart in a way that Victoria's achievements never could. My great-aunt Maria had immigrated to the United States with nothing but the clothes on her back and the determination to build a better life for her children. She understood what it meant to start from scratch, to create something valuable from limited resources, to persist in the face of uncertainty and skepticism. The sound of laughter from the patio indicated that the party was continuing without me, probably with Victoria holding court and Brandon nodding along supportively. I wondered what it would feel like to have a partner who celebrated my successes instead of tolerating my failures, who saw my unconventional path as an adventure rather than a series of disappointments. My dating life had been another source of family concern and Victoria's commentary over the years. While she had found Brandon during her second year of college, and maintained a picture-perfect relationship that progressed through all the expected milestones: engagement, career advancement, house hunting, wedding planning, I had stumbled through a series of relationships that never quite worked out. There had been Jake, the aspiring musician who had been threatened by my ambition and had tried to convince me that wanting financial stability made me materialistic. There had been Michael, the corporate lawyer who had been embarrassed by my irregular income and had constantly pressured me to get a real job with benefits and a predictable schedule. There had been David, the freelance photographer who had been supportive of my creative pursuits, but had been completely unreliable when it came to emotional or financial stability. Each relationship had ended with me feeling like I was too much or not enough, too ambitious or not ambitious enough, too creative or not practical enough. I had begun to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with me, some character flaw that made me unsuitable for the kind of stable long-term partnership that Victoria had found so effortless. But in the past 3 months, as my business had grown and my confidence had increased, I had started to wonder if the problem hadn't been with me at all. Maybe I had simply been trying to fit into relationships with people who couldn't appreciate the qualities that made me unique. Maybe the right person would see my unconventional path as a strength rather than a weakness. Sophia, my Aunt Carmen called from the doorway between the kitchen and the patio. Brandon is looking for you. He wants to ask you something about your business. My stomach dropped. The last thing I wanted was to discuss my work with Victoria's fiancé, especially after overhearing her dismissive comments about my latest scheme. But refusing would seem rude and would probably generate more family drama than simply enduring whatever condescending questions Brandon had prepared. I followed my aunt back to the patio, where the early evening sun was casting long shadows across the desert landscape that surrounded her house. The mountains in the distance were beginning to turn purple in the fading light, and the air carried the distinctive scent of creosote and sage that always reminded me why I loved living in Arizona despite all its challenges. Brandon was standing near the fire pit, holding a beer and wearing the kind of casual but expensive outfit that suggested careful attention to appearing effortlessly stylish. He was handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of symmetrical features and confident posture that had probably made him popular in high school and successful in business. But there was something about his smile that always seemed calculated, as if he were constantly evaluating how his interactions with other people might benefit or harm his own interests. Sophia called out as I approached, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm that people used when they were about to ask for favors. Victoria tells me you're starting some kind of online business. I'd love to hear more about it. Victoria was standing beside him, her expression a mixture of amusement and anticipation, as if she were looking forward to watching me struggle to explain my work to someone who actually understood business. She had changed into a different outfit since I'd last seen her, a flowing sundress that probably cost more than I used to make in a month, paired with jewelry that caught the light in a way that suggested real gold and genuine stuff. It's just a small blog about vintage fashion and collectibles, I said carefully, trying to strike a tone that was informative without being defensive. I help people find valuable pieces at thrift stores and estate sales, and I also offer personal shopping services for clients who want to incorporate vintage items into their wardrobes. Brandon nodded with the kind of polite interest that suggested he was waiting for me to get to the real point. That sounds interesting. Are you making any money with it yet? Or is it still in the hobby phase? The question was innocuous enough on the surface, but I could hear the underlying assumption that my work was probably not generating significant income. Victoria's smirk confirmed that she had set up this conversation specifically to highlight the gap between my small-scale efforts and Brandon's understanding of legitimate business success. It's growing steadily, I said, choosing my words carefully. I'm actually doing better than I expected when I started. That's great, Brandon said with the kind of patronizing tone that adults used when children told them about their lemonade stands. It's always good to have a side hustle. I actually do some consulting work on the weekends myself, just to keep my skills sharp and earn a little extra money for vacations and things like that. Side hustle. The phrase hit me like a slap across the face. Brandon had just dismissed my entire business, my newfound financial independence, my growing success, as a weekend hobby that might generate enough money for occasional luxury. Victoria's expression was pure satisfaction, as if Brandon had confirmed everything she had been saying about my inability to create anything substantial or meaningful. How much are you making? Victoria asked with fake concern. I just want to make sure you're being realistic about the potential here. So many people get excited about online businesses without understanding the actual economics involved. The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could feel the attention of nearby relatives focusing on our conversation, waiting to see how I would respond to Victoria's attempt to publicly expose what she assumed would be my embarrassingly small income. For 32 years, I had allowed Victoria to control the narrative about my life and my achievements. I had accepted her characterization of me as a dreamer who couldn't execute, a creative person who lacked business sense, a perpetual disappointment, who made the family worried about my future. I had internalized her criticism and used it as evidence that I was fundamentally flawed, destined to struggle while she succeeded. But sitting in my bank account was proof that everything Victoria believed about me, everything she had convinced our family to believe about me, was completely wrong. My little blog was generating more income per month than her prestigious corporate position. My hobby was attracting clients who were paying premium prices for services that only I could provide. My unrealistic dreams had become a thriving business that was growing faster than I could manage. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I'm doing quite well, better than I expected. Honestly. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing that something in my tone had shifted. Define quite well. Are we talking about enough to cover your expenses, or actual profit? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable now. She was pushing for specific numbers, confident that whatever I revealed would confirm her narrative about my inability to generate substantial income. Brandon was watching with the kind of interested detachment that suggested he was curious to see how this family dynamic would play out. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything about my relationship with my family. Last month, I made $47,000. The silence that followed my statement was so complete that I could hear the sound of wind chimes from my aunt's neighbor's yard and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Victoria's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, her expression frozen in a mixture of shock and disbelief. Brandon's polite smile faltered as he processed what I had just said. $47,000, Victoria repeated slowly, as if saying the words might reveal them to be a joke or a misunderstanding. In 1 month. In 1 month, I confirmed, feeling a rush of adrenaline that came from finally speaking the truth about my success, and that was actually lower than the month before, because I took some time off to reorganize my systems and hire additional help. Brandon's entire demeanor shifted as the implications of my statement sank in. The patronizing tone disappeared, replaced by the kind of sharp attention that successful business people reserved for potential opportunities or threats. He was looking at me with new eyes, evaluating me according to completely different criteria than he had been using 30 seconds earlier. "Wait," he said, setting down his beer and turning to face me directly. "You're telling me that your vintage fashion blog generated $47,000 in revenue last month?" "Not revenue," I corrected him, enjoying the way his eyes widened. "Profit, after expenses, taxes and paying my assistant." Victoria made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a choking noise. "That's impossible. You live in that tiny apartment downtown, you drive a 10-year-old Honda. If you were making that kind of money, you'd be living completely differently." "Would I?" I asked, genuinely curious about her assumptions. "Just because I can afford to upgrade my lifestyle doesn't mean I need to. I'm actually enjoying having financial security for the first time in my life. I'm in no hurry to increase my expenses just to impress people." The observation hit its target. Victoria's entire identity was built around displaying her success through visible markers of wealth and status. Her designer clothes, her expensive jewelry, her perfectly styled hair, her luxury car, her upcoming house purchase, all of these things served the dual purpose of making her feel successful and ensuring that everyone around her knew she was successful. The idea that someone could have substantial income without feeling compelled to broadcast it through conspicuous consumption was completely foreign to her worldview. It suggested that there might be other ways to define and experience success, other metrics that mattered more than external validation and social approval. "But how?" Brandon asked, his professional curiosity overriding the social awkwardness of the moment. "I mean, I work in marketing, and I understand digital business models, but those kinds of numbers usually require significant scale and infrastructure. How many clients do you have? What's your conversion rate? How are you handling customer acquisition costs?" His questions revealed that he was taking my claim seriously, which seemed to disturb Victoria even more than the original revelation of my income. She had been counting on Brandon to help her dismiss my success, to find the flaws in my story that would restore the familiar family dynamic where she was the achiever and I was the dreamer. "I have about 200 regular clients for my personal shopping services," I explained, warming to the subject now that I was talking to someone who understood business metrics. "My average transaction value is around $600. And my repeat customer rate is about 85%. Most of my new clients come through referrals from existing customers, so my acquisition costs are essentially zero." Brandon did the math quickly in his head, his expression growing more impressed by the second. "Jesus, Sophia, those numbers are accurate. You're looking at annual income in the mid-six figures. That's serious money." Mid-six figures. The phrase hung in the air like a revelation that changed the entire context of our family gathering. Victoria's face had gone pale, and she was gripping her wineglass so tightly that I worried it might shatter in her hand. The relatives who had been pretending not to listen to our conversation were now openly staring, trying to process the fact that the family disappointment had just revealed herself to be the family's highest earner. "This doesn't make sense," Victoria said finally, her voice tight with something that sounded like panic. "If you were making that kind of money, why didn't you tell anyone? Why are you still living like you're broke?" "I'm not living like I'm broke," I said gently. "I'm living within my means and saving most of what I earn, and I didn't tell anyone because I've learned that sharing good news with this family often results in more criticism than celebration." The words came out harsher than I had intended, but they reflected years of accumulated frustration with family dynamics that rewarded conformity and punished creativity. Victoria's success had always been celebrated because it followed a predictable path that everyone could understand and approve of. My success was being questioned because it didn't fit the narrative that the family had constructed about my capabilities and potential. That's not fair, Victoria protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We both knew that I was right about the family's tendency to find fault with anything that didn't match their expectation. Brandon was still processing the implications of my revelation, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he reevaluated everything he thought he knew about me. Sophia, I have to ask, this might sound weird, but would you be interested in doing some consulting work? The company I work for has been looking for someone who understands digital marketing for niche luxury markets. Your conversion rates and customer retention numbers are honestly better than most of the agencies we've worked with. The irony was almost too much to bear. Brandon, who had dismissed my work as a side hustle 5 minutes earlier, was now asking if I would be interested in consulting for his company. Victoria's fiancé, who had been nodding along supportively while she mocked my latest scheme, was now treating me as a peer whose expertise might be valuable to his professional network. I appreciate the offer, I said diplomatically, but I'm pretty focused on growing my own business right now. I'm actually in the process of launching a new service line that's going to require most of my attention for the next few months. What kind of new service line? Brandon asked, his tone now completely respectful and genuinely curious. Estate sale consulting, I explained. I help families identify and properly value vintage and antique items when they're settling estate. There's a huge market for it because most people don't know what they have, and they end up either keeping everything out of uncertainty or selling valuable pieces for far less than they're worth. Brandon nodded appreciatively. That's brilliant. You're monetizing expertise that most people don't even know they need until they're in a crisis situation. The profit margins must be incredible. They are, I confirmed, enjoying the way Victoria flinched at each mention of my financial success, and the emotional value to families is enormous. I had a client last month who discovered that her grandmother's costume jewelry collection included several pieces that were actually worth over $10,000 each. She had been planning to donate everything to Goodwill. $10,000, Victoria repeated faintly. For costume jewelry. For what appeared to be costume jewelry, I corrected. One of the pieces was a 1940s Cartier brooch that her grandmother had bought in Paris during her honeymoon. The family had no idea what they had, because it wasn't stored with the grandmother's other valuable jewelry. Brandon was leaning forward now, completely engaged in our conversation. How do you develop that kind of expertise? I mean, being able to identify valuable pieces that other people miss requires years of study and experience. It does, I agree. I've been collecting vintage fashion and studying decorative arts since I was in college. What started as a personal hobby became the foundation for a business when I realized how much demand there was for someone who could bridge the gap between academic knowledge and practical application. That's exactly the kind of expertise that companies pay consultants massive fees to access, Brandon said. You've essentially created a monopoly in a niche market that most people don't even know exists. Monopoly. The word seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her entire career had been built on competing within established corporate structures, fighting for promotions and recognition in environments where success was measured by climbing predetermined ladders. The idea that I had created my own market, my own rules, my own definition of success, represented everything she had never thought to want. I need another drink, Victoria announced abruptly, turning away from our conversation and heading toward the bar area that my uncle had set up near the pool. Her exit was so sudden and dramatic that it drew the attention of relatives across the patio, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop on our increasingly intense conversation. Brandon watched her go with an expression that suggested he was seeing his fiancé's behavior from a new perspective. I should probably apologize for Victoria's reaction, he said quietly. I think she's just surprised. She's always talked about you as someone who was still figuring things out professionally. Victoria has always had very specific ideas about what success should look like, I said, diplomatically. My path hasn't matched those expectations. Brandon nodded slowly, and I could see him reconsidering everything Victoria had told him about me during their relationship. Can I ask you something personal? Why did you keep this secret from your family? I mean, this kind of success is something most people would want to celebrate and share. The question was fair, and Brandon's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Because I've learned that my family's reaction to my achievements is often more complicated than simple celebration. Victoria has spent years positioning herself as the successful sister and me as the family disappointment. Revealing that I've actually been more financially successful than she is would force everyone to reevaluate narratives that they've been comfortable with for a long time. And you didn't want to deal with that disruption, Brandon said, understanding immediately. I didn't want to deal with the aftermath, I confirmed. Success that threatens other people's self-concept often generates more resentment than admiration. I was enjoying having something that was entirely mine, something that Victoria couldn't criticize or diminish. Brandon was quiet for a moment, processing my explanation, and probably reflecting on his own relationship with Victoria. That's actually really wise, he said, finally. Most people would have used this kind of success as ammunition in family conflict. The fact that you kept it private suggests a level of emotional maturity that's pretty rare. His comment was so unexpected and so different from anything I had ever heard from one of Victoria's boyfriends that I found myself looking at him with new interest. All of Victoria's previous relationships had been with men who either ignored me completely or treated me with the kind of polite dismissal that suggested they had absorbed Victoria's narrative about my inadequacies without question. But Brandon was engaging with me as an equal, asking thoughtful questions about my business and showing genuine respect for my achievement. He was treating me like someone whose opinions and experiences mattered, someone worth getting to know beyond the superficial characterization that Victoria had provided. "Can I ask you something?" I said, emboldened by his openness and the surreal nature of our conversation. "Of course. What did Victoria tell you about me before tonight?" Brandon's smile was rueful. "Honestly, she painted you as someone who was creative but not practical, ambitious but not focused, someone who had a lot of potential but couldn't seem to execute on any of her ideas. She talked about you with a lot of affection, but also with a kind of worried concern, like you were a younger sister who needed guidance and protection." Younger sister. The phrase stung because it revealed how Victoria saw me and how she had trained others to see me as well. Despite being only 2 years older, she had positioned herself as the responsible adult and me as the impractical child who needed supervision and management. "And now," I asked. Brandon looked toward the bar where Victoria was standing with her back to us, apparently engaged in intense conversation with our cousin Elena. "Now I'm wondering how many other things I've misunderstood about your family dynamics." The observation was perceptive and slightly unsettling. Brandon was clearly intelligent and observant, which made me wonder why he had been so willing to accept Victoria's characterization of me without question. Had he simply trusted her judgment, or had he been too uninterested in her family to dig deeper into the relationships and personalities involved? "Victoria isn't lying when she talks about my past struggles," I said fairly. "I did bounce between jobs and relationships for years. I did try a lot of different things that didn't work out." Her assessment of my track record has been basically accurate until very recently, but she's not accounting for the possibility that those experiences were building towards something, Brandon said thoughtfully. "Sometimes what looks like failure from the outside is actually experimentation and skill building that eventually leads to breakthrough success." His insight was exactly what I had needed to hear during the difficult years when I was struggling to find my direction. The jobs that hadn't worked out had taught me about different industries and business models. The relationships that had ended badly had helped me understand what I needed in a partner. The creative projects that had failed had developed skills and connections that had eventually become the foundation for my current success. But no one in my family, including Victoria, had ever framed my unconventional path in those terms. They had seen only the failures and the instability, not the learning and growth that had been happening beneath the surface. "That's a much more generous interpretation than I usually get from my family," I admit. "Maybe your family has been too invested in one particular definition of success to recognize that you were creating your own," Brandon suggested. The comment was so insightful and so different from the superficial observations I usually heard from Victoria's boyfriends that I found myself wondering who Brandon really was when he wasn't playing the role of supportive fiancé to my sister's drama. "Good evening, C." The words came from behind me, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. I turned to find a tall man with salt and pepper hair and intelligent gray eyes approaching our conversation area. He was wearing a casual but expensive-looking shirt and had the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "I'm sorry," I said, confused by his greeting and uncertain whether he was talking to me or to Brand. "Charles Morrison," the man said, extending his hand to me with a warm smile. "I'm the founder and CEO of Morrison Digital Marketing, and unless I'm very much mistaken, you're Sophia Rodriguez, the founder of Hidden Treasure." I shook his hand automatically, my mind racing to understand how this stranger knew my name and my business. "I'm sorry, have we met? I don't remember." "We haven't met," Charles said with obvious amusement, "but I've been following your work for the past 2 months. My wife is one of your clients. She hired you to find vintage Hermes scarves for her collection, and she's been raving about your expertise and professionalism ever since." Brandon's eyes widened as the implications of Charles Morrison's presence and recognition became clear. Morrison Digital Marketing was one of the most prestigious firms in Phoenix, with offices in 6 major cities and clients that included Fortune 500 companies and high-profile celebrities. "Your wife is Mrs. Morrison?" I asked, pieces clicking into place. Patricia Morrison had been one of my most demanding but also most rewarding clients, a sophisticated collector who had challenged me to find rare pieces that required months of research and networking to locate. "She is indeed," Charles confirmed, "and she's not easily impressed. I can tell you that. When Patricia starts recommending someone's services to her friends, that person has earned serious credibility in our social circle." I was beginning to understand that Charles Morrison wasn't just a successful businessman, he was part of the elite network of wealthy Phoenix residents, who collected art, supported cultural institutions, and moved in circles that most people only read about in lifestyle magazines. "Patricia has already referred 3 other clients to me," I said, still processing the surreal nature of this conversation. "I had no idea she was married to you. She likes to keep her collecting activities separate from my business world," Charles explained. "But when she mentioned that she'd found someone who could source authentic 1950s Hermes pieces in perfect condition, I had to ask more questions. Do you have any idea how rare that expertise is?" Brandon was listening to our exchange with growing amazement, clearly recognizing that my business operated at a much higher level than he had initially understood. The fact that I was providing services to the wife of one of Phoenix's most prominent business leaders elevated my work from side hustle to legitimate luxury business serving elite clientele. "I've been very fortunate with my client base," I said, modest. "Fortune has nothing to do with it," Charles said firmly. "Patricia showed me some of the pieces you found for her, along with the detailed provenance research you provided. That level of expertise and attention to detail doesn't happen by accident. You've clearly invested years in developing knowledge that most people in the luxury goods industry don't possess." Provenance research. The phrase reminded me of how much work went into each client relationship, how many hours I spent verifying the authenticity and history of the pieces I sourced. My clients weren't just buying vintage fashion items, they were buying stories, heritage, and the confidence that came from knowing exactly what they owned and why it was valuable. "Actually," Charles continued, "I've been hoping to run into you at some point. Patricia has been encouraging me to reach out to you about a potential business opportunity. We're launching a new division focused on luxury lifestyle consulting, and we need someone with your specific expertise to head up our vintage acquisitions and authentication service." The words hit me like lightning. Charles Morrison, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Arizona, was offering me a business opportunity based on work I had been doing quietly in my small downtown apartment. The validation was overwhelming, but more than that, it represented recognition from someone who understood business at the highest levels. "What kind of role are you envisioning?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through my system. "We're talking about a consultancy position that would allow you to maintain your existing business while also providing expertise to our corporate clients," Charles explained. Think Fortune 500 executives who want to incorporate authentic vintage pieces into their art collections, or luxury hotels looking to source period-appropriate furnishings for renovation projects. The fee structure would be substantially higher than your current retail clients, and we'd handle all the marketing and client acquisition. Brandon was staring at me with an expression of complete amazement. The conversation had moved so far beyond his initial dismissal of my work as a side hustle that he seemed to be struggling to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "That sounds incredible," I said honestly, "but I have to ask why you're approaching me instead of working with established auction houses or dealers who already serve that market." Charles smiled approvingly. "Because the established players in that market are focused on moving inventory, not on providing the kind of detailed research and storytelling that you offer." Patricia showed me the documentation you provided with her Hermes purchases. "You didn't just authenticate the pieces, you traced their ownership history, identified the specific years they were produced, and even found photographs of similar pieces being worn by notable figures from that era. That level of service creates emotional value that goes far beyond the monetary investment." Emotional value. The phrase captured something essential about my approach to vintage collecting that I had never been able to articulate clearly. I wasn't just selling beautiful objects, I was selling connections to history, to craftsmanship, to stories that made each piece unique and meaningful. "Most of our potential clients have enough money to buy whatever they want," Charles continued. "What they're looking for is expertise that helps them buy the right things, pieces that will appreciate in value while also providing personal satisfaction and cultural significance. You've somehow figured out how to deliver all of that in a single service offering." The conversation was surreal. 3 hours ago, Victoria had been mocking my work in front of our relatives, dismissing it as another failed attempt at financial independence. Now one of Phoenix's most prominent business leaders was describing my expertise in terms that suggested it was both rare and valuable at the highest levels of commerce. "I'd be very interested in discussing this further," I said, trying to match Charles's professional tone while internally celebrating what felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. "Excellent," Charles said, pulling a business card from his wallet. "Give me a call next week and we'll set up a proper meeting. I think you'll be impressed by what we have in mind." He shook hands with both Brandon and me before walking away, leaving us standing in stunned silence as we processed what had just happened. Brandon was looking at me with an expression that suggested he was seeing me as a completely different person than the one Victoria had described. "Sophia," he said finally, his voice filled with something that sounded like awe, "do you understand what just happened? Charles Morrison doesn't approach people at family barbecues to offer them business opportunities. He's one of the most selective and successful entrepreneurs in the Southwest." I was still holding Charles's business card, running my thumb over the embossed lettering that spelled out his name and title. The physical reality of the card made the entire conversation feel more real, more concrete than the dreamlike quality it had possessed while it was happening. "I'm still processing it," I admitted. 6 months ago I was worried about making rent, and now Charles Morrison wants to discuss a consulting partnership. It doesn't feel entirely real yet." "It's real," Brandon said emphatically. "And it's the kind of opportunity that could transform your business from successful to legendary. Morrison Digital Marketing has connections that could open doors you probably don't even know exist yet." His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, so different from the patronizing tone he had used when he thought my work was just a hobby. But there was something else in his expression now, something that looked almost like regret or confusion. "Brandon," I said carefully, "can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable? After everything that's happened tonight, I think we're beyond worrying about comfortable questions. What are you thinking about Victoria right now? I mean, how does this change things between you two?" Brandon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the patio to where Victoria was still standing near the bar, surrounded by relatives who were probably asking her questions about the dramatic conversation they had witnessed. "Honestly," he said finally, "I'm amming how many other things I've been wrong about. Victoria has spent our entire relationship painting you as someone who needed guidance and support, someone who was creative but not capable of serious business success. She positioned herself as the responsible sister who had figured out how to navigate the real world, while you were still chasing dreams. And now, Now I'm realizing that you've built something that's more impressive than anything I've accomplished in my corporate career. You've created a business that serves elite clients, generates substantial income, and could potentially scale into something much larger with the right partnerships. That's not the work of someone who needs guidance. That's the work of someone who sees opportunities that other people miss. His analysis was accurate but also deeply unsettling. If Brandon was reevaluating his understanding of me, he was probably also reevaluating his understanding of Victoria and the dynamics that had shaped their relationship. Does this change how you see Victoria? I asked. Brandon's pause was longer this time, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful and slightly troubled. It makes me wonder why she felt the need to diminish your accomplishments. I mean, having a successful sister should be something to celebrate, not something to hide or minimize. The observation cut straight to the heart of the family dynamics that had shaped my entire adult life. Victoria's need to position herself as the successful sister had required positioning me as the unsuccessful one. Her identity as the family achiever had been built on a foundation that required my failure or at least my mediocrity. Victoria has always defined herself in contrast to me, I explained. She's the responsible one because I'm the irresponsible one. She's the practical one because I'm the dreamer. She's the success because I'm the failure. If I'm actually successful, then her entire self-concept becomes more complicated. That's not healthy, Brandon said bluntly. Success isn't a zero-sum game. Your achievements don't diminish her. No, but they do challenge the narrative she's used to organize her understanding of our family and her place in it. Change is hard, especially when it requires admitting that you've been wrong about something fundamental for a long time. Brandon nodded slowly, clearly thinking about the implications of my explanation for his own relationship with Victoria. What do you think she's going to do now? I mean, this revelation changes everything about tonight, and probably about your family dynamics going forward. Before I could answer, Victoria herself appeared beside us, her face flushed and her expression tight with emotions. I couldn't quite identify. She had clearly been drinking more than usual, and her carefully controlled demeanor was showing cracks that revealed the turmoil underneath. Well, she said with forced brightness, it seems like everyone's talking about Sophia's amazing business success. Congratulations, sis. I had no idea you were doing so well. Her tone was congratulatory on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something that sounded like hurt or betrayal or confusion. She was struggling to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the successful entrepreneur who had just revealed herself. Thank you, I said carefully, unsure how to navigate this new dynamic between us. I have to ask though, Victoria continued, her voice taking on the slightly sharp edge that appeared when she felt threatened or uncertain. Why didn't you tell me? I mean, we're sisters. We tell each other everything. Why would you keep something this big a secret? The question was loaded with hurt and accusation, but it was also fair. Victoria had shared every detail of her career advancement, her relationship milestones, her financial achievement. From her perspective, my secrecy probably felt like betrayal or rejection. Because I was afraid of this, I said honestly, gesturing to the tension that was crackling between us. I was afraid that my success would become another source of competition between us, instead of something we could celebrate together. Competition? Victoria's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of nearby relatives. Why would I compete with you about this? I'm happy for you. I'm proud of you. But even as she said the words, I could see the struggle in her eyes. She wanted to be happy for me, but she was also grappling with the reality that everything she had believed about our relative positions in the family hierarchy had been fundamentally wrong. Are you? I asked gently, because you've spent the entire evening telling people that I'm a dreamer who can't execute, that my business is just another failed scheme, that I'm someone who needs to be more realistic about my prospects. Victoria's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I saw past her defensive anger to the confusion and hurt underneath. I didn't know, she said quietly. You never told me how well things were going. When you said you were starting an online business, I thought it was like the yoga instructor thing or the freelance writing. I thought you were going to struggle for a while and then move on to something else. Her explanation revealed the trap we had both been caught. Victoria's expectations of my failure had been based on my past track record, but they had also become self-fulfilling prophecies that made it difficult for me to share success when it finally arrived. "I know you didn't know," I said softly, "but Victoria, you never asked. You assumed you knew how things were going based on your existing beliefs about my capabilities. You never considered that this time might be different." Brandon was watching our conversation with obvious discomfort, probably realizing that he was witnessing the kind of family confrontation that couples usually experienced in private. But he was also seeing Victoria in a new light, observing behavior that revealed aspects of her personality that might have been hidden during their courtship. "So what happens now?" Victoria asked, her voice small and uncertain. "I mean, where does this leave?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Victoria was asking about more than just our immediate relationship. She was asking whether the revelation of my success meant that all of our family dynamics would need to be renegotiated. "That depends on you," I said honestly. "I'm the same person I was this morning, Victoria. The only thing that's changed is that you now know the truth about my financial situation. The question is whether you can accept that truth without it threatening your sense of your own achievement." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing my challenge and probably struggling with emotions she wasn't accustomed to feeling. She had spent so many years being the successful sister that she didn't have frameworks for handling a situation where I might be more successful than she was. "It's just hard," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been the one who had everything figured out. You were the one who needed help and guidance. This changes everything about how I see myself and how I see you." Her honesty was painful but also encouraging. Victoria was at least acknowledging that her worldview had been challenged, that she needed to reconsider assumptions she had been carrying for years. "You don't have to see yourself differently," I said gently. "You're still successful, Victoria. You still have a great career and a wonderful relationship and a bright future. My success doesn't diminish any of that. But it changes the story," she said, looking directly at me for the first time since this conversation had begun. "The story I tell myself about who we are and what our relationship means. If you're more successful than I am, then what does that make me?" The vulnerability in her question broke my heart. Victoria had built her entire identity around being the successful sister, and the revelation that I might be more financially successful than she was had shaken her sense of self in ways I hadn't anticipated. "It makes you my sister," I said firmly. "It makes you someone who has achieved great things in her own field, someone who has built a life she's proud of, someone who deserves love and respect regardless of how much money either of us make." Brandon stepped closer to Victoria, putting his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of support that seemed genuine rather than performative. "Sophia's right," he said quietly. "Your worth isn't determined by comparison to other people, even family members. You're successful in your own right." But even as he spoke the words of comfort, I could see something shifting in Brandon's expression as he looked at Victoria. The revelation of my success had changed more than just his understanding of me. It had also changed his understanding of the woman he was planning to marry. Victoria leaned into Brandon's embrace, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed everything that had happened. "I need some time to think about this," she said finally. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," I said, understanding that Victoria needed space to recalibrate her understanding of our relationship and her place in the family hierarchy. But as Victoria and Brandon walked away together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between all of us. The revelation of my success had exposed family dynamics that had been hidden for years, and there was no going back to the comfortable fiction that Victoria was the achiever and I was the dreamer. The rest of the family reunion passed in a blur of conversations with relatives who suddenly wanted to know more about my business, my plans, and my perspective on various topics. The revelation of my financial success had changed how everyone saw me, transforming me from the family disappointment into someone whose opinions and experiences were worth taking seriously. My uncle Roberto, who had barely spoken to me at previous family gatherings, spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about online marketing and e-commerce. My cousin Maria, who had always treated me with polite but distant courtesy, suddenly wanted to discuss her own ideas for starting a business. Even my father, who had spent years expressing concern about my unstable career path, pulled me aside to tell me how proud he was of what I had accomplished. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. For years I had craved recognition and validation from my family, but now that it was being offered so freely, it felt hollow somehow. Their interest in me seemed to be based entirely on my financial success rather than on any genuine curiosity about who I was as a person, or what my experiences had taught me. As the evening wound down and relatives began saying their goodbyes, I found myself standing alone on my aunt's back patio, looking out at the desert landscape and trying to process everything that had happened. The mountains in the distance were silhouetted against a star-filled sky, and the air carried the distinctive scent of cooling desert plants that always reminded me why I loved Arizona, despite all its challenges. "Quite an evening," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Brandon approaching, looking thoughtful and slightly subdued. Victoria was nowhere to be seen, and I assumed she was inside helping with cleanup or saying goodbye to relatives. "That's one way to put it," I replied. "How is Victoria doing?" Brandon was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "She's struggling. This revelation has challenged some fundamental assumptions she's held about herself and about your family for a long time. She needs time to process and adjust." "And how are you doing?" I asked. "This can't be easy for you either." Brandon's laugh was rueful. "Honestly, I'm questioning my judgment about a lot of things right now. I pride myself on being a good judge of character and business potential, but I completely misread your situation. Victoria told me you were creative but not practical, ambitious but not focused. I accepted that assessment without ever really talking to you myself or trying to understand what you were actually doing." His admission was both gratifying and troubling. It was validating to have someone acknowledge that they had misjudged me, but it was also concerning that someone as intelligent as Brandon had been so willing to accept second-hand information without verification. "Why do you think you did that?" I asked. "Because it was easier," Brandon said honestly. "Victoria had a clear narrative about your family dynamics, and accepting that narrative meant I didn't have to invest the time and energy to form my own opinions. I was lazy, basic." The self-awareness was impressive, but it also raised questions about what other aspects of his relationship with Victoria might be based on similar intellectual shortcuts. "What happens now?" I asked. "I mean, between you and Victoria." Brandon was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was troubled. "I don't know. Tonight has revealed some things about Victoria's character that I hadn't seen before. Her need to diminish your accomplishments, her inability to celebrate your success without feeling threatened, her willingness to publicly criticize you based on assumptions rather than facts. These aren't qualities I want in a life partner." The observation was harsh but fair. Victoria's behavior throughout the evening had revealed aspects of her personality that would be concerning in any relationship, but especially in a marriage where mutual support and encouragement were essential. "Are you thinking about calling off the engagement?" I asked, surprised by my own directness. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," Brandon said carefully. "Victoria and I need to have some serious conversations about what tonight revealed and what it means for our future together. I can't commit to spending my life with someone who feels threatened by other people's success, even family members' success." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that neither of us wanted to explore too deeply. The revelation of my business success had set in motion changes that would ripple through family relationships in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I should probably get going," Brandon said after a moment. "Victoria is ready to leave, and we both need time to think about everything that's happened." "Of course," I said. "Brandon, thank you for listening tonight. Thank you for taking my work seriously and asking thoughtful questions. It means more than you probably realize." "Thank you for sharing your story," he replied. "And Sophia, for what it's worth, I think Charles Morrison is right. What you've built is genuinely impressive, and you should be proud of what you've accomplished." After Brandon left, I spent another hour at the reunion, saying goodbye to relatives and helping with cleanup. But my mind was elsewhere, processing the events of the evening, and trying to understand what they meant for my relationships with Victoria, with my family, and with my own sense of identity. The drive home to my downtown apartment, gave me time to reflect on everything that had happened. The revelation of my financial success had changed how everyone saw me, but it had also forced me to confront questions about what success actually meant, and whether external validation was worth the complications it created. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the drive home. Relatives who wanted to congratulate me, family friends who had heard about the evening's revelations, even a few people I hadn't spoken to in years, who had somehow learned about my business success through the family grapevine, but there was no message from Victoria. When I arrived at my apartment, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside, looking up at the building that had been my home for the past 4 years. The one-bedroom unit on the third floor was small and modest, furnished with a mixture of vintage finds and budget furniture that reflected my aesthetic preferences and financial limitations when I had moved in. Now, with my business generating substantial monthly income, I could afford to move anywhere I wanted. I could buy a house in Scottsdale like Victoria was doing, or rent a luxury apartment in one of the upscale developments that had been built throughout Phoenix in recent years. I could upgrade my car, my wardrobe, my entire lifestyle if I chose to, but as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I realized that I wasn't ready to make those changes yet. The modest lifestyle I had maintained even after my financial situation improved had protected me from the kind of scrutiny and judgment that Victoria faced constantly. It had allowed me to enjoy my success privately, without feeling pressure to perform wealth, or to justify my choices to family members who might not understand them. My apartment looked the same as it had that morning, but it felt different somehow. The vintage furniture and collectibles that filled the space were no longer evidence of my inability to afford better things. They were conscious choices that reflected my aesthetic preferences and professional expertise. The carefully curated collection of fashion magazines and design books weren't signs of unrealistic dreams. They were tools of a trade that had proven to be more lucrative than anyone had imagined. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite chair, a 1950s armchair that I had found at an estate sale during my early days of vintage hunting. The chair had cost me $50 when that was money I couldn't afford to spend, but it had become the centerpiece of my living room, and a symbol of my commitment to surrounding myself with beautiful, meaningful objects, regardless of my financial circumstance. My laptop was sitting on the coffee table where I had left it that morning, open to emails from clients and inquiries from potential customers who had found my website through referrals or social media. The business that Victoria had dismissed as a hobby was thriving in ways that required my constant attention and management. I opened my email and found a message from Patricia Morrison, Charles's wife, sent just an hour earlier. Sophia, I heard from Charles that he had the opportunity to meet you this evening at your family gathering. I'm so excited that you two finally connected. I've been telling him for months that he needs to meet the brilliant woman who has been finding impossible pieces for my collection. I hope you'll consider his consulting proposal seriously. It could be exactly the kind of opportunity that takes your expertise to the next level. Looking forward to our next shopping adventure. Patricia. The email was warm and encouraging, but it also reminded me that my professional relationships existed in a completely different sphere from my family relationships. Patricia Morrison saw me as an expert and a valued service provider. Charles Morrison saw me as a potential business partner with rare expertise. My clients treated me with respect and appreciation that I had never experienced from my own family. The contrast was both enlightening and sobering. The people who paid me for my services valued my expertise and trusted my judgment, while the people who shared my DNA had spent years questioning my competence and dismissing my achievements. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and I knew that she had probably heard about the evening's revelations through the family network that carried news faster than any social media platform. "Mija," she said as soon as I answered, her voice filled with excitement and confusion. "Your Aunt Carmen called me and told me about what happened at the reunion tonight. Is it true? Are you really making as much money as she said?" The question was typical of my mother's direct approach to family matters. She wanted facts, not feelings, and she wanted them immediately. "It's true, Mom. My business has been doing very well for the past few months." $47,000 in 1 month? Her voice rose with amazement. "Sophia, that's more than your father and I make together in 3 months. How is this possible?" I spent the next 20 minutes explaining my business model, my client base, and my growth trajectory to my mother, who listened with the kind of focused attention that she usually reserved for medical diagnoses or financial planning sessions. "And you didn't tell us because," she asked when I finished my explanation. "Because I was afraid of exactly what happened tonight. I was afraid that success would create more family drama than failure ever did." My mother was quiet for a moment, processing my explanation, and probably reflecting on the family dynamics that had made me feel the need to hide good news from the people who claimed to love me. "Mija, I'm proud of you," she said finally. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm proud of how you handled yourself tonight. But I'm also sorry that you felt like you couldn't share this with us earlier. That's our fault, not yours." Her words brought tears to my eyes that I hadn't realized were building. The validation and acknowledgement from my mother meant more than all the congratulations from relatives who barely knew me. "What about Victoria?" I asked. "How is she handling all this?" "Victoria is learning that the world is more complicated than she thought it was," my mother said diplomatically. "She's always been so certain about everything, so sure that she understood how life worked and what success looked like. Tonight challenged those certainties, and that's not easy for someone like your sister." "Is she angry with me?" "She's angry with herself," my mother said gently. "She's angry that she misjudged you so completely, and she's angry that her need to be the successful sister blinded her to your actual achievements. But anger at yourself often gets directed at other people, especially family members." My mother's insight into Victoria's emotional state was both comforting and troubling. It suggested that the tension between Victoria and me was likely to continue as she processed the implications of my success for her own identity and self-concept. "What should I do?" I asked. "Give her time," my mother advised, "and don't let her reaction diminish your sense of accomplishment. What you've built is impressive, Mija. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise, not even your sister." After ending the call with my mother, I sat in my quiet apartment and tried to process everything that had happened in the span of a single evening. The revelation of my financial success had changed how everyone in my family saw me, but it had also forced me to confront questions about what I wanted from those relationships going forward. For years I had craved recognition and validation from my family, especially from Victoria. I had wanted them to see me as successful, competent, and worthy of respect. Tonight I had gotten exactly what I thought I wanted, but the experience had been more complicated and less satisfying than I had imagined. The validation felt hollow because it was based entirely on monetary success rather than on appreciation for who I was as a person or what my journey had taught me. The recognition felt conditional because it seemed tied to my ability to impress people with numbers rather than to any genuine understanding of my values, my creativity, or my resilience. More troubling was the realization that my success had exposed family dynamics that were unhealthy and potentially destructive. Victoria's need to diminish my achievements in order to maintain her own sense of superiority was problematic regardless of our relative financial position. Brandon's willingness to accept second-hand information about my character without ever trying to form his own opinions suggested a level of intellectual laziness that was concerning in someone I had always considered intelligent and thoughtful. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about Charles Morrison's business proposal and what it might mean for my future. The opportunity to consult with high-level corporate clients through his firm could transform my business from a successful individual enterprise into something much larger and more influential. But it would also mean stepping fully into the world of business success that came with visibility, scrutiny, and expectations that I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. The privacy and autonomy that I had enjoyed while building my business in relative obscurity would disappear once I became associated with Morrison Digital Marketing and their elite client base. The choice felt symbolic of larger questions about what kind of life I wanted to build and what kind of success would actually make me happy. Did I want to scale my business into something that would impress people like Victoria and Brandon, or did I want to maintain the more intimate, personal approach that had brought me satisfaction as well as financial reward? My phone buzzed with one final text message as I was turning off the lights. The message was from Brandon, sent nearly 2 hours after he and Victoria had left the reunion. "Sophia, I wanted to thank you again for tonight's conversation. It opened my eyes to a lot of things I hadn't been paying attention to. I also wanted to let you know that Victoria and I have decided to postpone our engagement while we work through some issues that tonight brought to the surface. This isn't your fault, and I hope you don't feel responsible for any complications this creates. What you shared tonight was brave and necessary, and I'm grateful that you trusted us with the truth about your success. The message was both shocking and somehow not surprising. The revelation of my financial success had exposed cracks in Victoria and Brandon's relationship that had probably been there all along, hidden beneath the surface of what had appeared to be a perfect partnership. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions as I processed Brandon's news: relief that he had recognized the problematic aspects of Victoria's behavior, guilt that my revelation had contributed to their relationship crisis, sadness that Victoria's struggle with my success was causing her pain in multiple areas of her life. But underneath all of those emotions was something that felt like liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I was being seen and appreciated for who I actually was rather than for who my family thought I should be. The people who mattered in my professional life respected my expertise and valued my judgment. The clients who paid for my services trusted me to understand their needs and deliver results that exceeded their expectations. The recognition from my family that I had craved for so long had finally arrived, but it had come at the cost of revealing how conditional and superficial their love and respect had always been. They were proud of me now because I was making money, not because they had gained any deeper understanding of my character, my values, or my journey. As I finally fell asleep that night, I realized that the evening's revelations had given me something more valuable than family validation. They had given me clarity about what kind of relationships I wanted to cultivate and what kind of success would actually fulfill me. The question now was whether I had the courage to build the life I actually wanted, rather than the life that would impress the people who had never really understood me in the first place. The following Monday morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. The events of the family reunion had crystallized something important about the direction I wanted my life and career to take. Charles Morrison's business card was sitting on my kitchen counter, and I knew that the conversation we would have could change everything about my professional trajectory. I called his office at exactly 9 o'clock, speaking with his assistant who immediately recognized my name and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. The speed and efficiency with which the appointment was arranged told me that Charles had already briefed his staff about my potential importance to whatever project he had in mind. Morrison Digital Marketing occupied the top 3 floors of one of Phoenix's most prestigious office buildings, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the desert landscape and the city sprawl beyond. The reception area was decorated with contemporary art and designer furniture that suggested both success and sophistication. Charles greeted me personally, which surprised me given his status as the founder and CEO of such a large company. He led me to a conference room where Patricia Morrison was waiting, along with 2 other people who were introduced as the heads of their luxury lifestyle division. Sophia, Patricia said warmly, rising to embrace me as if we were old friends rather than client and service provider. I'm so excited that you're here. Charles has been talking non-stop about the possibilities since he met you yesterday. The meeting that followed was unlike any business conversation I had ever experienced. Instead of treating me as a potential employee or contractor, Charles and his team approached me as a peer whose expertise they needed and respected. They had clearly done extensive research on my business model, my client base, and my approach to vintage authentication and sourcing. What we're proposing, Charles explained, is essentially a partnership that would allow you to maintain complete autonomy over your existing business while also providing specialized services to our corporate clients. Think of it as adding a luxury consulting division to your current offerings, with our firm handling all the client acquisition and project management. The financial terms they proposed were staggering. My consulting fees would be triple what I charged my individual clients, and Morrison Digital Marketing would guarantee a minimum number of projects per month that would essentially double my current income even if I took on no additional individual client. But more than the money, what impressed me was their understanding of what made my services unique and valuable. They weren't trying to change my approach or standardize my methods to fit their corporate system. They recognized that my success came from providing personalized, research-intensive services that couldn't be replicated through traditional business processes. We've seen what happens when luxury service providers try to scale by removing the personal touch, said Jennifer Walsh, the head of their lifestyle division. The result is always a diluted product that doesn't justify premium price. What we're proposing is scaling through exclusivity rather than volume. Scaling through exclusivity. The concept resonated with everything I had learned about building a successful business in the luxury market. My individual clients paid premium prices because they knew they were getting access to expertise and attention that wasn't available anywhere else. The corporate clients that Morrison Digital Marketing wanted to serve would have the same expectations and the same willingness to pay for truly exceptional service. By the end of the 2-hour meeting, I had agreed to a partnership that would begin with a 3-month trial period during which I would take on 2 corporate consulting projects while maintaining my existing client base. If the arrangement worked well for both sides, we would formalize a longer-term partnership with expanded responsibilities and compensation. Walking out of that meeting, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different version of my professional life. The validation from successful business people who understood what I had built was profoundly different from the family recognition that had come only after they learned about my financial success. Charles, Patricia, and their team appreciated my expertise for its own sake, not as a symbol of conventional achievement. That evening, I received a call from my mother informing me that Victoria had asked the family not to discuss the events of the reunion with anyone outside our immediate circle. She was apparently struggling with the public nature of her emotional reaction and wanted time to process everything without additional scrutiny or commentary. She's embarrassed, my mother explained. Not about your success, but about how she handled the revelation. She knows she didn't react well, and she's trying to figure out how to move forward without making things worse. The news about Victoria's request for privacy made me realize that the ripple effects of that evening were still spreading through family relationships in ways I hadn't anticipated. Brandon's decision to postpone their engagement had apparently become public knowledge among our relatives, generating exactly the kind of attention and speculation that Victoria had always tried to avoid. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected text message from Victoria asking if we could meet for coffee. The message was brief and formal, lacking the casual warmth that had characterized our communication before the reunion, but it represented the first direct contact between us since that awkward evening on my aunt's patio. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in central Phoenix that neither of us frequented regularly. Victoria looked tired and stressed, with none of the polished confidence that usually characterized her appearance. She had clearly been going through a difficult period, and I felt a surge of sympathy for her despite everything that had happened between us. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble as soon as we sat down with our drinks. "The way I spoke about you at the reunion was unfair and hurtful. I let my own insecurities and assumptions cloud my judgment, and I treated you badly in front of our family." Her directness surprised me. Victoria had never been quick to acknowledge mistakes or apologize for behavior that hurt other people. The fact that she was taking responsibility for her actions suggested that the events of the reunion had forced her to engage in some serious self-reflection. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means a lot to hear you acknowledge what happened. I've been thinking a lot about why I reacted the way I did," Victoria continued, "and I've realized that my identity has been way too tied up in being the successful sister. When I learned about your business, it felt like the foundation of my self-concept was being challenged." Her honesty was both painful and encouraging. Victoria was admitting to psychological patterns that had shaped our relationship for years, patterns that had required my failure or mediocrity in order for her to feel secure in her own achievements. "What are you going to do about that?" I asked gently. "I'm seeing a therapist," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to understand why I felt so threatened by your success and how to build a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on comparison to other people, especially family members." The admission shocked me. Victoria had always prided herself on her emotional stability and self-awareness, The idea that she needed professional help to process her relationship with me suggested that our family dynamics had been more damaging than either of us had realized. "That's really brave," I said sincerely. "It takes courage to acknowledge that patterns aren't working and to seek help changing them." "Brandon helped me realize that I needed to do something," Victoria said sadly, "before he decided that he couldn't marry someone who felt threatened by other people's success. He said that watching me react to your news showed him aspects of my character that made him question whether we were compatible long term." The pain in her voice was unmistakable. Victoria was dealing with the loss of a relationship that had been central to her identity and her future plans, and she was doing so while also confronting uncomfortable truths about her own behavior and psychology. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling genuine regret for the role my revelation had played in the dissolution of her engagement. "I never intended for my news to affect your relationship with Brandon." "It's not your fault," Victoria said firmly. "Brandon was right to be concerned about what my reaction revealed. If I can't celebrate my own sister's success without feeling diminished, then I'm not ready to be a supportive partner to anyone." Her self-awareness was both impressive and heartbreaking. Victoria was taking responsibility not just for her behavior toward me, but for the psychological patterns that had made her unsuitable for the kind of partnership that Brandon needed and deserved. "What happens now?" I asked. "Between us, Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions she was still trying to formulate. "I'd like to start over," she said finally. "I'd like to get to know you as the person you actually are, not as the person I assumed you were based on my own needs and insecurities." The request was both simple and profound. Victoria was asking for the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than competitive comparison. She was acknowledging that she didn't really know me as an adult, that her understanding of my character and capabilities had been filtered through her own psychological needs, rather than based on objective observation. "I'd like that too," I said honestly, "but it's going to require both of us to change patterns that have been in place for years." "I know," Victoria said. "My therapist says that changing family dynamics is some of the hardest work people can do, because everyone has to participate in order for real change to happen." Over the following months, Victoria and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship on more honest and equitable terms. She made genuine efforts to understand my business and to celebrate my successes without feeling threatened by them. I worked to see her achievements as independent of my own rather than as implicit criticism of my choices and capabilities. The process wasn't always smooth or comfortable. Years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding didn't disappear overnight, and we both had moments of falling back into old patterns of competition and defensiveness. But gradually, we began to develop the kind of sisterly relationship that we had never had as adults. My partnership with Morrison Digital Marketing flourished beyond anyone's expectations. The corporate consulting projects introduced me to clients and opportunities that transformed my understanding of what was possible in the luxury services market. Within 6 months, I was working with Fortune 500 companies, high-end hotels, and private collectors whose purchasing power and aesthetic ambitions far exceeded anything I had encountered in my individual client base. The success brought new challenges and new decisions about the direction I wanted my career to take. The demand for my services was growing faster than I could handle alone, but scaling the business would require hiring and training additional staff, developing standardized processes, and accepting a level of visibility and responsibility that would fundamentally change my relationship with the work I love. 1 year after the family reunion that had changed everything, I found myself standing in the conference room of Morrison Digital Marketing, looking out at the Phoenix skyline, and reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Charles had just offered me a full partnership in the company, with equity ownership and executive responsibility for what had become their most profitable division. The offer represented everything that conventional measures of success suggested I should want: prestige, financial security, professional recognition, and the opportunity to build something larger than myself. But it also represented a choice between the intimate, personal approach that had originally brought me satisfaction, and the corporate scale that would maximize my impact and income. As I considered Charles's offer, I thought about the conversation I had planned to have with Victoria that evening. She had been promoted to regional marketing director at her company, and was planning to buy a house in one of Scottsdale's most desirable neighborhoods. She was also dating someone new, a man who seemed to appreciate her ambition rather than feeling threatened by it. The parallel trajectories of our success felt symbolic of how much our relationship had changed. We were both thriving professionally, but we were doing so in ways that supported rather than undermined each other. Victoria's achievements no longer required my failure, and my success no longer felt like a rebuke to her choices. The family dynamics that had seemed so fixed and permanent had proven to be changeable when everyone involved was willing to do the difficult work of examining their own motivations and patterns. The reunion that had exposed years of hidden resentment and competition had ultimately created space for more honest and supportive relationships. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Morrison, who had become not just a client but a genuine friend and mentor. She was inviting me to a gallery opening where several pieces from her vintage collection would be displayed alongside contemporary works that had been inspired by historical fashion and design. The invitation reminded me that the most meaningful aspect of my work wasn't the money or the recognition, but the relationships and connections that grew out of shared appreciation for beauty, craftsmanship, and history. Whether I accepted Charles's partnership offer or chose to maintain my independence, those relationships would continue to be the foundation of whatever I built next. As I walked out of the Morrison digital marketing offices that evening, I realized that the question wasn't whether I wanted to be successful by conventional measures, but whether I wanted to define success on my own terms or allow other people's expectations to shape my choices. The family reunion that had begun with Victoria calling me a loser had ended up teaching all of us that success was more complicated and more personal than any of us had understood. The recognition and validation that I had thought I wanted from my family had turned out to be less important than the self-knowledge and authentic relationships that had emerged from the chaos of that revealing evening. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.